Thank you all for joining us here. We're just going to wait a few more minutes while people trickle in. It's great to have you, and thanks again for taking some time out of your day. The topic for today's webinar is community moderation. This is our third in a series of Ning Talks with Richard Millington. Richard is an expert in community management, founded Feverbee, an online consultancy firm, and he runs its accompanying professional community management training course. Richard has recently published a book called Buzzing Communities, which is fabulous. I encourage you to check that out if you like what you see here today. Our first Ning Talk with Mr. Millington was called How to Increase Activity in Your Community. The second was How to Grow an Online Community, and both recordings are available on our Vimeo page. That's at vimeo.com/Ning. Again, today's webinar is about the process of moderating an online community. And if you do have to leave early, don't worry, we are recording this webinar as well, and we'll post it to our Vimeo page in the next day or so. I'll also be sending out a direct link to the recording in a follow-up email. My name is Allison Leahy, and I'm the community manager at Ning. I'm also here with my fabulous colleague, Juana, who is also on Ning's advocacy team, and we'd like to thank you for joining us today. We are going to be using a hashtag today. There are some limitations regarding chat in the GoToWebinar platform, so I encourage you to get to know each other by using the hashtag NingTalk. So that's hashtag NINGTALK. One thing I would ask, though, is that you continue to direct any questions to us using the questions feature in GoToWebinar. Feel free to shoot us a question whenever it comes up. The questions we receive, we will ultimately try to make some time and answer at the end of Richard's presentation. So we are very lucky to have Richard here today, and without further ado, I will pass it over to Richard Millington.
Hi, Alison. Thanks for that very kind and generous introduction. So today, if you recall the webinars that we've done before, we looked at first how to increase activity in an online community. And one of the things that we looked at there was what can you do in the community that really makes a difference in terms of generating activity. So we looked at the types of discussions that you can initiate. We looked at the type of content that you can create. And we looked at the type of activities that you can undertake in your community. All of these were things that you can directly do in your online community to increase the level of activity. And in the second webinar, we looked at growth. So we looked at how you grow an online community. We looked at how you get people to visit your community in the first place, how you convert the newcomers into regular members of the community. And then we looked at a variety of different tactics and approaches that you can use to continue growing the community and the different stages of the life cycle where each of those tactics are most relevant. And today, what I want to talk about is one of the topics that comes up most often when people talk about online communities, which is moderation. And what you'll find today is that most people have the wrong idea about what moderation is. It is about handling the activity in the community, but it's not about just removing the bad stuff. And what I want to do during this lecture today, or this webinar today, is to try and understand the broader role of moderation, try and understand all the different things that you could be doing here. So the second thing is to establish a moderation objective for your community. So you shouldn't just be aimlessly moderating your community. You should have a clear goal for where you want your community to go. The third is to develop guidelines for your community. We covered this a little bit when we talked about how you grow a community and how you convert newcomers of your community into regular members of your community. Then we want to go into the things that people generally find most interesting, which is how do you resolve conflicts in your community? And how do you resolve the antagonistic members in your community? Then we'll look at how you stimulate and sustain a high number of discussions. We covered this a lot in the increasing activity phase, so I'm not going to spend that much time on this. And finally, we'll look at how you steer an online community. How do you get people in your online community to do what you want them to do? So we can get quite academic when we talk about moderation, but what I want to stress is that I think moderation itself is a wrong term to be using, and we should be talking about facilitation. We should be talking about how you facilitate a greater level of activity in your community. We should be talking about how you make sure that everyone that has an opinion in your community is motivated and isn't prevented from contributing that opinion, isn't prevented from participating in your community. And that generally means two different things. The first is removing the barriers to participation. In every online community, there are certain tangible and intangible barriers to participating in that community. And second, we want to look at how you create the motivation for people to participate in your community. But let's break both of these two things down. When we're talking about the barriers to your online community, what prevents people from participating in your online community? We're generally talking about five specific things. The first is spammers. I think we all know what spammers are. They're people that come to your community under different guises to promote something that's completely irrelevant to your community. Now, in just a small dose, it doesn't have much of an impact. But if a community becomes overwhelmed with spammers, then obviously that's going to be a big issue. The second is inappropriate material. Material that isn't relevant or material that simply doesn't fit what your community is about. If you're getting lots of links to porn or anything like that, then obviously that's going to be a barrier to participating in your community. People won't be able to find the good stuff in your community. The third is conflicts. And what we'll learn a bit later on is that conflicts themselves aren't necessarily bad things. In fact, conflicts can be a positive thing for many online communities. But a conflict that spirals out of control, a conflict that affects every area or every discussion in the community, becomes a barrier to that community. And the fourth is information overload. So we covered this already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But information overload is when there's too much activity taking place in your community that no one can follow what's going on. There's too many things that are taking place that people can't find the things that they're interested in. So you can control that by looking at the social density of your community and how you increase that social density or dissipate that social density. And fifth is a lack of narrative in your community. So a lot of online communities simply don't have a narrative that their members can follow. Members don't know what role they're playing in the broader context of that community. So these are all barriers that you have to prevent or have to remove to successfully enable someone to participate in a community. But simply enabling someone to participate in a community isn't enough. There are a lot of platforms out there that are very good at dealing with these barriers here, but are terrible at creating the motivation for someone to participate. So by motivation, we're talking about initiating discussions, but making sure that these discussions are relevant to members, making sure that members want to participate in this community, making sure that members can always find something that they're interested in that community. It's about soliciting contributions to the discussion, reaching out to members. It's about recognizing your members. When members do something good, how do you recognize that? How do you use that recognition to stimulate further activity in your community? It's about having the right guidelines in place in your community. And also it's about highlighting the popular material in your community. People want to do what they see other people doing. So it's very important in your community efforts that you're highlighting what people in your community are doing. So we're going to go into each of these in a little more depth. But first, I want to cover the moderation objective for your community. So if you're going to be moderating your community, you shouldn't just be aimlessly doing it. You shouldn't just be removing anything that you consider bad, because how do you know what's bad? Where do you draw the line? Sometimes it's a good idea to allow off-topic posts in the community, and sometimes it isn't. But that's why you need a moderation objective which fits with where your community is going now. So if you want to increase the number of participating members in your community, that would be a very different tactic or a very different approach that you would use than if you just wanted to increase the number of posts. So if you have a lot of posts from a very few members, then you have to concentrate on increasing the number of participating members in the community, not necessarily the increasing the number of posts. So that would be greater levels of recognition. It would be looking at your newcomer to regular conversion funnel. It will be a variety of things like that. If you want to increase the number of discussions, so there's a difference between the number of posts and the number of discussions. So you can have very few discussions that get a huge number of responses, a huge number of posts, but it doesn't benefit your community that much because there aren't that many discussions. And so if you want to increase the number of discussions, it usually means moving the community away from what it is now, moving the community so they're talking about other things than what they are now. How do you keep fresh discussions taking place? How do you make sure that your community is on the cutting edge of its field? If it's a community of practice, for example, then you want to be making sure that any changes in the political environment or technological environment, economic environment, any changes that's new, any changes going to have an impact on your community's field are mentioned here. You want to be able to be sure that you're always generating fresh discussions. So your approach to moderation will be to highlight those sorts of fresh discussions, will be to generate more activity there. Fourth is to improve the quality of discussions. So quality is a very subjective term. But if you feel that your community is going downhill, if you see that members aren't talking about things that are useful to other members, then your objective might be to improve the quality of discussions in that community. Fifth would be to facilitate closer relationships between members, but I'm not going to cover that in this lesson today. And sixth is to steer the community in a direction where it needs to go, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So let's begin with community guidelines. I know we focused a little bit upon this when we did converting newcomers into regulars, but if you missed that, then I'm going to cover it again now. But I do recommend that you go back to that webinar as well. So for community guidelines, the biggest mistake that most organizations make is spending too much time on them. The problem with guidelines is that they're usually too restrictive. They tell people what they can't do rather than what they can do in a community. So if you look at guidelines like this, for example, it's too long. It's a full set of rules telling people what they can't do, but no one is going to read this. So instead of having guidelines that tell people what they can't do, you need to have a welcome guide that defines what members can do in the community. And that usually means co-creating a constitution as well. So in a welcome guide, what you want is how members can get started in your community. So what are the very first things that they can do? And it's a good idea here to have a relevant discussion that's taking place in the community that they can participate in. You also want to cover the community culture. So when people visit a community for the first time, they're going to have certain reservations about participating. They're going to have what's called a social fear of participating. So what they need to do is be guided on what the culture of the community is. What does a typical post look like? How do people respond to that community? And you might also want to include here the history of the community. So the history helps create a narrative for that community, it helps create how people can participate in the community. What is their broader role within that community? And alongside that, we also recommend having a constitution which details the purpose, the personality, the beliefs, and the governance of the community. So again, you can go back to the last webinar to find out more about this. But what this basically does is it's something that's co-created with your members, and it becomes that founding document of the community. It describes what the goal of the community is. What is the community supposed to achieve in the world? How does it help its members? And that can be help their informational needs. It can be helping their social needs. So it can be anything along those lines. It can also be about the personality of the community. If sarcasm is tolerated, if swearing is tolerated, anything along these lines can be great as well. And it also highlight the beliefs of the community. What does the community believe to be true? What is the community against? And finally, it will showcase what the governance of the community is. And so by governance, what we mean is what are the rules about how members are supposed to behave? What behavior is expected of both the members and the person that's running the community? So let's move on to conflict resolution, because I think this is going to be why most people are here right now. At some point in your community, two or more of your members are going to have a fight. And the problem with the internet is that no one will back down. Whereas in the real world, people might agree to disagree, online they don't have the same incentive to do that. What happens online is that because every response that you make is visible, because it's not just to you, it's to the whole community. When someone attacks your viewpoint or attacks you in any way, you feel you have to defend yourself. You feel you have to defend yourself in front of everyone. Otherwise, you're having that loss of face. You have to face that, and it's a really difficult thing to do. So conflicts online tend to spin out of all control. You can have conflicts between two people that go for over 500 posts. That means 250 times they had to go there and respond to that discussion that's taking place. But the interesting thing about conflicts is that conflicts can be good for an online community. And what I mean by that is if you look at how online communities develop, and this is very important, but if you look at how online communities develop, they go through a phase where initially everyone is polite to one another. And this goes for every online group or offline group as well. Initially, everyone is polite and they don't reveal their true selves. And what happens is that communities and groups they go through this phase where they're not so polite to each other, where they have these conflicts, where they begin to express themselves openly and honestly and say what they really feel about different issues. Now, this is an important stage for a community to go through. And one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of community managers do is that they get involved in conflicts too quickly. As soon as two members disagree, they get involved and they stop there. And that's a big mistake. It's a big mistake because conflicts don't have to be bad for a community. Not only are they good in terms of developing that online community, they're also good in the sense that conflicts also increase the level of activity. No one leaves in the middle of a fight. So conflicts can help increase activity in the community. It can provide different viewpoints that people can understand and support. So it can be a good regular thing. So conflict can develop the community. It can increase the number of repeat visits. But you should only be getting involved in one of two situations. The first is when the conflict gets personal. So if someone starts attacking someone personally and not about the issue that they were initially discussing, then that's a good time to get involved because you don't know where that ends. And second, if there's a direct threat made. So if there's a direct threat against another member of the community, then obviously you have to get involved then because you never quite know where that's going to end up. And I'm sure we've all heard the stories of where it has gone entirely out of control. Another thing that tends to arise from conflicts as well is that they're fine when they're controlled in one or two discussions that are taking place in the community. But when it comes a lesser disagreement about the issue and more personal animosity between two or more members of the community, then it's important to get involved because this can then engulf all the different discussions that take place in your community. So if you can see from your data that there's a declining number of members in your community, and it seems to be the result of the conflict taking place in your community, that's a good time to get involved. But when you do get involved, there's a certain approach you have to take. And the first is to do it individually. So you can't resolve a conflict in front of the whole community. So what you have to do is reach out individually to your members. And you have to tell them directly, not that you're upset with them and don't make it from you, but you have to tell them that it's hurting the community or you've had complaints from the community. If you do this the wrong way, then these people that are having a conflict, they turn against you. You have to be very clear that you're acting on behalf of the community, not on behalf of what you think or feel, but you're acting on behalf of the community. So you shouldn't be in these messages that you put here. Another thing that's important is to what we call rig the game against the participants. This is from game theory, where neither of these people can participate in the community anymore until they have both written to you and stated that they've resolved the differences between them. So then they're both motivated to resolve those those differences between themselves because they can't participate in the community again until they do. Another thing that's important, if you're trying to resolve a conflict, you have to prevent that loss of status. So you have to make sure that neither person is or feels that they have lost some status in the community, that they've lost the argument. If you can remove that fear of loss of status amongst other members in the community, you're going to find that far more people, or it's far easier to resolve the conflicts that take place. But you can't just remove the main post itself. You have to resolve the underlying cause of the conflict, the underlying disagreement between the two. Why did it move from a disagreement about the issue to a disagreement about everything between these two people or two or more people? So, when it comes to conflict resolution, there are certain proven techniques that you can use here. So there's a lot of academic data that you can use, and there's lots of material that's been written about how you resolve a conflict. But there are 5 approaches that typically tend to work. The first is by persuading one member to cave to the other member. And you can do this in a way where you say it's better for the community. You can do it in a way where, in exchange for caving to the other member, letting that other member have the last word, then it's possible to give them something else in exchange, perhaps their own column or their own post in the community, or interview them for the community. So it's a level of accommodation that takes place. The second is avoidance. I'm not a big fan of this, where you don't resolve the problem at all, but you distract the participants into doing something else. This rarely works, but I wouldn't typically recommend it for you. The third is collaboration. So you encourage the two people to work together to find a solution. And the issue with this is that it's very difficult to do, but if it does work, it's the best solution that you can have to resolving a conflict. So, for example, if you want two people to collaborate, then you might set up or you might set up a joint task or a challenge that they both have to participate in to resolve. Try and find if they can create a ebook, perhaps that both uses their sides of the story, or find a way that they can work together to find out what the answer to that problem is. The fourth is by compromise. So where they both have to give way in some regard, where they find out what the minimum acceptable thing is to them all. What are they each going to accept to continue participating in the community without any further issue that takes place? And the fifth is competition. So in competition, it's where both people compete to win the conflict. So this can work really well if it's done right. So, for example, what we quite often used to do in the video gaming online communities I used to be involved with, was when two or more people had a conflict about an issue that's getting personal, we would set up a poll, and where they could each recruit their friends to vote on who they thought was what was right. And so it's quite intense for a week or so, but at the end you have that resolution. You have the point that they've competed and someone's won. The community has supported one side or the other. So you have that, and then you can move on past that. The other thing that you often come up against, and perhaps more so than conflict resolution, is antagonistic members. So antagonistic members come in a variety of different forms, and we'll come to that in just a second. But there's a ladder of escalation that you can follow here. So if you have people in your community that are being provocative, that are annoying other members, that are trolling, that are spamming, there are stages of escalation that you can follow. But the key thing isn't to spend too much time doing this. The mistake that a lot of community managers make is that they spend hours upon hours thinking how they can deal with the difficult members in the community. And that's simply not a good use of your time. It's far better to spend most of your time focusing upon the members that are happy in your community and keeping them happy than it is to spend time with the members that are upset and are provoking other people. So you want to deal with the problematic members as quickly as possible. And so there's this ladder of escalation that we use for our clients. The first thing we recommend is to do nothing. And the reason we recommend that is that provocative members aren't always bad. So provocative members play a role in a community. If you think about any community, there's going to be people there that most of the community members don't like. So that means that these people play a role in that they unite the rest of the community against them. They also play a very interesting role in the sense that they can come up with different viewpoints, they can prevent groupthink, they can bring across the issues that other members aren't keen on bringing up. So doing nothing very often is a viable strategy to take. When that isn't possible, you either want to take the approach of reasoning with these members, explaining why their behavior isn't acceptable. This is quite basic stuff. Um, Try and befriend them, try and understand what their issues are, and try and see if you can resolve those issues, or distract them, put them in charge of something that's completely irrelevant to the community. Give them a column that doesn't get much notice in the community. Invite them to write a blog post, because the more time they spend doing that is less time they can spend annoying other people in your community. If that doesn't work, then you go down to suspension, where you suspend a member from the community for a specific amount of time. If that doesn't work, then something else that can work is where you edit the provocative comments and put something quite mild in instead. And failing that, then you can outright ban the people that are responsible. I find that most community members are very hesitant to ban the bad people in the community. They will bend over backwards to accommodate these people in their community, but they'll do a very bad job of actually banning them. You don't have to be entirely fair. You don't have to have a whole judicial process here. What you can do is just ban people if they aren't a good fit for your community. You're the guardians of your community, so you have a certain responsibility to make sure that your community is as good as it can be. Occasionally, what you find is that people that are banned keep coming back, but that's just a process you go through. It doesn't happen that often, but if it does happen too often, then you might have grounds to contact the ISP or the police. But it's incredibly rare it will ever get to that stage. In all the communities I've been involved with, that's probably happened maybe no more than 5 times. So let's take a look at this table here, because what it outlines here is the different approaches you can take to dealing with these problematic people in your community. So what you find when it's just a bot that's spamming the community, that's obviously an immediate ban. But when it's a real person that's spamming the community they're joining and they immediately spam, that's obviously an immediate ban. There's no point in going through that whole escalation process then. But if it isn't that, if it's people that are actively participating in your community and perhaps occasionally spam with their own work or promote their own material, then it's a good idea to go through the escalation ladder. If it's someone that's trolling in the online community, someone that's provoking other people, deliberately provoking other people, then again you go through that escalation ladder. But remember, with trolls, they can be doing a good, positive thing for your community. And if it's just an antagonist, someone that is in the community but isn't a troll, but tends to be very disliked by most people in the community for their opinions or their viewpoints in the way they express themselves. And again, it's a case of going through the escalation ladder. Or perhaps for people that aren't a good fit for your community, people that don't share the viewpoints or the passions or the ideas of your community, perhaps you do just want to remove them. Perhaps you don't spend too much time on getting these people into the right track in your online community. And finally, if it's two or more members that are fighting in the community, then you go through the conflict resolution technique. So finally, and this is a shorter webinar than the ones we've done in the past. So finally, I want to look at how you steer an online community. So steering an online community is one of the most important things you can do. If you steer your community the right way, you make sure that your community is always fresh. It's always talking about very relevant things that are happening. You make sure that you always have reasons for members to join, and that the community, most importantly, the community is just always really interesting. And you have a lot of influence in your community to steer what's happening in the community. You can use your content to highlight and recognize members that are in the community, especially those that are making the types of contributions that you want to encourage. If you have activities taking place, you can have activities or live discussions about new and fresh topics that are taking place in your online community. And if you have discussions, you can turn these discussions into sticky threads. So if you look at this community here, if you look at right at the top, and I think this is Seth Godin's Tribes community, if you look at right at the top on the forum, you get to decide what appears at the top there. You get to decide which discussions, which topics you want people to be discussing. And when people discuss these topics, you can turn them into sticky threads in your community. You can make sure that they appear at the top of your community. You can guide more people to talk about this. And when people post discussions that don't or aren't as good fit for the community, or questions that have been asked many times before, you can help drop them down by making sure that other discussions get more attention than those discussions. So you have a lot of very subtle influence that you can use in your online community. And so it's always a good idea, especially this is why it goes back to your motivation objective. Once you know what you need to achieve or where your community needs to go, you have that great power to steer where that community does go. So if you want your community to be discussing, say, the latest marketing tactics in your community, it's a good idea to either initiate a discussion and make sure that appears at the top of the forum for a period of time, or find people that are already talking about that and giving more attention to these issues. And Ning is very good here because there are a variety of different ways of doing this. So here you have the featured discussions, where they use it to highlight the discussions that are getting a lot of attention and things that they want people to be participating in more frequently. And then another very good point here is that if you have a discussion that's really taken off and it's turning into a universal discussion that lots and lots of people are participating in, it's a good idea to make sure that appears very high up, because then it does become that universal discussion. It becomes a type of discussion where everyone can and wants to participate in. Other ways you have influence, I think this is from the handmade community on Ning. So if you look what they have here, they have pictures that appear right at the top of the community. They have on the left-hand side another image there. But if you look at this community, what you don't see is what they're guiding people towards right now. So they can highlight the pictures based upon things that they want to be focusing upon for that month. So one of the things we recommend for a lot of communities that are struggling is to have a theme for that month, a theme for that topic, and have more forum posts about those topics, have pictures about or picture collection about those topics, have events or activities or live discussions about those topics. So all these things that you can do to generate more activity in your online community. And the key thing is that you're using this. The key thing is that you're using all of these things. So one of the things that I do recommend you do, if you didn't watch our webinar on increasing activity, well, we went really in depth on the types of discussions that are taking place, how to initiate those discussions, how to make sure that your discussions are very popular. Then I do recommend that you spend some time checking that out, because you should find it quite useful. But the key thing here again is to give more attention on the contributions that you want to encourage. So don't just have don't just have it in a random place, but actively guide and actively drive your online community, making sure that you are giving a lot of attention to the type of discussion that you want to encourage. Make sure that you're analyzing the broader environment of the community. If you run a community about fishing and there are certain types of new fishing rods that are out that are controversial, it might be good to have regular discussions taking place about that, because it's what's new. And more than anything, communities want to discuss what's new. So you can spend a lot of time doing that. So if you haven't done this before, I'm sure you're used to this slide by now, but you can download half of my book for free if you go to www.feverbead.com/ning.html. Please don't forget the HTML. And we'll leave this up probably for a while, but we'll see. We might take it down once the word gets out about it. And if you want to buy the book, Buzzing Communities, you can buy it on Amazon.com. Okay, if anyone has any questions, now's a good time to ask. Alison, if you're there, the questions aren't showing up for me, so I might need you here.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Yes, we do have some great questions for you. So let's begin with the first one. It comes from Ben Martin. How effective are introduce yourself threads in a community?
So we covered this a bit in the last webinar that we did. I generally don't like introduce yourself threads because they don't have any real impact upon the community. They don't tend to be a stepping stone to getting more involved. What I do like is that when people join a community, they have a discussion they can participate in that solicits their opinion on an issue. So, what are the biggest issues that are taking place in your community or in your community's field? And have regular discussions about that, and then guide newcomers to participate in that. Because then this is also a thread that other people in the community are going to read, whereas those introduce yourself threads typically aren't read at all. So that's what I would recommend.
Okay, great. And another one just came in from Terry. She says that she has a member who posts videos all day long and wonders what she can do about this. She thinks they're inappropriate and wants some advice on how to handle that kind of activity.
So there are a couple of different things you can do here. So first, assuming that the videos are bad, and I'm just going to assume that they are. First, I would reach out to her and say that the community would rather that there weren't so many so many videos in the community. But what we would love is, one video of the week about the community's topic, and she can be in charge of that. So you're kind of distracting her a little bit, but also getting her more involved. So you're not pushing her away, but you're giving her something that she can be responsible for. So one video every Friday afternoon, for the entire week. And if she disobeys that, then you can escalate it further beyond that. But first, yeah, I would just try to reason with her or him, and then distract them.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. She chimed in there to just to throw out that those videos are not relevant to her community. I think that's something that many of us see, people trying to either promote their own work or, just not sticking on topic. So that's great advice to try to steer the conversation back. And another one here comes from Keith. Keith is wondering specifically about what types of features to use in a community. Do you recommend using a blog and a forum, or is that repetitious?
So this is a tough question to answer because it depends so much based upon the community and what your audience wants. What I like a lot is having a forum that appears at the top of the community. So if you look at rockandrolltribe.com, I like their layout a lot. I like baristaexchange.com a lot. I like those sorts of communities. But then having a blog page beneath that or to the side, where people can contribute their ideas and opinions.
All right, very good. We're getting a few questions here about Richard's previous webinars with Ning, namely increasing activity, which he mentioned just a bit earlier. That video is available on our Vimeo page, so that's vimeo.com/NING. And I'll be sending out a link to this recording. I can also put in the links to the previous webinars in there, so you'll get that email in just a day or two. And one question from Zena here is it ever a good idea to be confrontational about members' lack of participation? For example, in her community, they've launched a project and folks seem to be, that seems responsive to a pressing concern among our members. So she's addressing a concern within the community, yet the community is not joining in or promoting it. So maybe how best to focus the community on throwing their 2 cents in there and making that a productive discussion.
So there are two parts of this. The first is if you've launched something in your community and your community isn't getting behind it, then it's probably because they're not that interested in it, or they're not as interested in it as you think they are. And it's very difficult to accept that at times, because we all want to achieve certain things in our communities, but that happens. But what you can do is interact with, say, 10 members in your community at random, ask them what they're really interested in, ask them what the biggest challenges are, and then create a project based upon that. The second part of that is if you want to get people more engaged in the community, then complaining about the fact that they're not that active is going to do more harm than good. It's basically going to tell people that in your community that most people aren't active in the community. And since people do what they see other people doing or what they think they see other people doing, then that's going to do more harm than good. I would focus upon the people that are participating. I would give a lot of attention to the people that are participating and try and give the impression that it's quite popular, quite successful. Interview the people that are participating, create discussions, chart milestones, no matter how small those milestones are. Try to get that impression of momentum that's taken off there.
All right, very good. And one more question here from Todd Kavanaugh. This one particularly relates to internal company social platforms. Todd says that he has both an online and offline daily interaction with employees. Does the offline interaction affect the way you moderate the online interactions?
Yes, because from the offline interactions, you know more about the personality, you know more about members, you know more about the people you're trying to reach. And it's also going to be very difficult to remove someone if you're going to see them in the canteen, you know. So what I would say there is that yes, but it's going to be very difficult to specify how without knowing more about your audience and more about what they're doing. What typically happens in communities with both online and offline groups is that you know so much more about the people you're trying to reach. You can identify what people are talking about offline and continue that online. You can use the online community to provide a location where people can learn more about that topic, where they can decide who they support on that topic, where they can help each other. So it really helps to augment those offline discussions with online discussions as well. I hope that makes sense.
I think so, yes. And all right, we'll just throw one more out there and then wrap it up. Thank you
Sure.
all again for joining us here today, and we do hope you keep us on your radar. We're going to be having a few more of these Ning talks with Richard in the future. So this one I come across fairly often. It is on the issue of self-promotion, specifically if you have a community, or specifically this community is based around wedding planning and baby showers, and members, when they're trying to help each other out, point them perhaps to their own product pages as well as promote themselves on their profile pages. And Harry would like to know if how to control the amount of self-promotional posts and what the best way would be to filter those and to have her community members actually take advantage of the advertising relationships that she offers in her community.
So I struggled with this question for a while until about 2 years ago. Someone told me what they do in their online community to deal with self promotion, and it was an idea that I tried once and it worked quite well. They were getting a lot of self promotion in your community, in their communities, members that were promoting their own services or products or their friends. What they decided to do was say, you're not allowed to do that anymore. except on Friday afternoons. So every Friday afternoon became a promotional day where people had a set format where they could promote whatever they wanted, and it became an activity for the community because those people that were promoting those things always had to have new ideas or new things that they could be promoting, or to offer discounts or to do anything along those lines. So it was something that worked really well for her. And I'm not saying this will work in every online community, but it's something that the community looked forward to because it's a promotional day. It was very interesting to be a part of. So perhaps that might not work for you, but it's something that I've seen work well before. Was the second part to that question how to promote yourself? Um, I'm not sure I was, but if it was the case, then what I would recommend here is that it's a good idea to be a part of the discussion rather than try and control the discussion. So a friend of mine runs a HR company here in London, and he was having a lot of difficulty meeting the key people in the HR scene and getting people to buy the service that he was selling. But one of the things that he did was that he created a online community for HR professionals in London, specifically those above the standard level. And he just initiated discussions and different things that tended to come up. And whenever anyone mentioned a problem that they were struggling with, he would make a note of it, and the next day he would get one of his employees to reach out to that member and ask if they would want any help resolving that problem. So it wasn't intrusive in the community, it wasn't over promotional. It's just looking for what problems that members were having, and then getting someone outside of the community to contact them to see if they could help or if they wanted help.
All right, sounds great. And we got a lot of positive feedback for that promotional Fridays. That's a fantastic idea. Um, well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us here today. I've had a really great time. I hope you have as well. And thank you, Richard, for taking the time to share your wonderful words of wisdom.
Thanks for having me. It's been terrific to be here as always. And if anyone has any questions about this webinar after this, then you can contact me, richard@feverbee.com. Thanks a lot, everyone.